This is the Westside King's Church podcast, where we aim to encounter and embody the surprising grace of Jesus.
Hi, Brian. It's nice to be back here with you again. So this is our last session. I can't believe that this is the 6th session. It's gone by so fast, these conversations, and I've really valued them, and I hope they've been helpful for our community. I think it's helpful to mention right up the top that it is our intention at some point to bring us all together in person with some of these conversations and have a chance to kind of process these things together, right? You do miss something when we don't get to be face to face, but we're hopeful that these are at least a little bit helpful for the meantime, and look forward to at some point in hopefully the near future that we can get together as a group and process these things as a community. So we today are talking about a few different things. One of the things we're going to kind of start off with is about this idea of honoring grief. And I love that conversation about honoring grief. And we're going to talk about that through like continuing bonds and sort of the idea of having special occasions and holiday seasons and how we manage those. Why don't you start us off with our conversation on honoring our grief?
Yes. And the last session we talked about grief. We can put it in the drawer where it doesn't see the light of day, or we can open the drawer and we can take it out, wear it and talk it and hopefully get comfortable with it. So to do that, we need to make some choices. So as the last session, I started with a story. I would like to start with another story.
I would love this story.
Yeah, it's another holiday story. It's becoming kind of a bit humorous, but you just never know where, but somewhere you're going to run into somebody that's grieving. So this was a story on the east side of Canada. And we were out visiting family. And again, it was mid-morning. We're driving down a secondary road. And we passed this house at like 90 kilometers an hour. But I see it. And something clicked. And I said, we've got to stop. I know that house. And we went down the road, we pulled into a parking lot, and I thought about it. And I remember it was on a show, it was on TV, and it was on artists of the West Coast that were unique in the artistry that they did. And that caught me. And it's interesting, and again, how things work is that on TV, it was about the artist, but something clicked when I saw the house. Yeah. Because there was a sign in front of the house. So we pulled in the parking lot. I and my oldest son and Connor in the car. I said, I just want to go check the house out here. I just want to see if the artist is still there. Anybody want to come? Connor, who I think was 9 at the time, says, yeah, I'll go. Mm-hmm. So we walk across the road, and it's a beautiful old house, turn of the century home. It's a heritage home. First of all, it's spectacular. We walk around to the back door, and it's got the shutters down. There's a sign that acknowledges that there's tours and that it's definitely got an art basis in regards to what's happening here. So I knock on the door, nothing. I ring the doorbell, and then I'm thinking, maybe there's nobody home. But then I hear something in the house. And I'm thinking, okay, there's somebody home. And then you start to think, okay, do I run? Do I make a break for the car? Or do I stay the course? And I waited there, and the shutter opens up, and the individual looks at me really disheveled, like in a t-shirt. And I'm thinking, oh boy, what have I done? And he goes and he puts his hand up and puts his finger up, and it's like, I'll be right back. So then I'm in no man's kind of land right there, thinking, what am I doing? So he comes back, he opens the door, and you can see he just roughly kind of combed his hair, put a full shirt on. It says, come in, sits down at the table. And I said to him, I recognized your house. And I said, I remember it was your wife that was the artist. And so I saw the sign, and I thought I would come in and ask if you were still doing the tours. And there's this moment of silence. And he says, my wife just passed away several months ago. And of course, in me, I'm like, okay, here we are. My young son is sitting at the table, and I just kind of didn't miss a beat. I said, um, she was a well-known artist in the community. And his eyes kind of lit up and said, yes, she was an author, and she made all sorts of things. She worked with fabric. And he says, would you like to come outside and I can show you around a little bit? So we go outside and we're walking around the property. He said she wrote a book based on this landscape here. And then he took me to this little chapel, small little tiny chapel that somebody must have built in their backyard. And he says, yeah, we got that brought home, and she always wanted to do something with it. There was room for like 8 people in it, but it was very quaint. So it gave me a bit of an indicator that there was something, again, spiritual kind of going on. So we go back into the house and we sit down, and he says, there are some other things. And he shows us around the house a little bit. And he really enjoyed talking. And so we got back to the kitchen table. And I said, so a little bit, how long has it been? He says, it was in the spring. And I said, so are you remembering her? Do you have some of the art? Are people, some of the things dear to you? I said, what are you doing to kind of keep your wife's present close to you and holding her? He says, I don't know what to do. I just don't know what to do. I haven't been out of the house in 2 weeks. I have a friend that drops in, and immediately I knew that we were in getting back to that diagram where you can avoid your grief or you can find a way to heal. He was in that avoidance side, and he was isolated, and he was fearful, and he was very sad. And so opened up the dialogue into, has there been any times, when's the anniversary? I hit upon your wife's birthday, and he said, yeah. He says, ironically, you should say that because her birthday's coming up, and I don't know what to do. And so I said, well, what did she usually do? He said, well, we used to go to the bakery, and she used to love these special cupcakes, and we used to have a coffee. And I said, so have you ever thought about going back to the bakery and maybe getting a cupcake? He said, oh, I could never do that. Mm-hmm. I said, so did your wife have some friends? He said, yeah. I said, we've got friends. He said, oh, I haven't seen them a couple of months. I said, do you think anybody'd be interested in having a cupcake and remembering your wife? And he thought about that for a minute. This was something totally that he had never considered. And he said, I think maybe we could. I said, I'm a grief. I said, I work in the area of grief. Mm-hmm. I said, the one thing about grief is about being able to find a way to hold those ones in our hearts. And how do we're able to do that? And this was a new concept. And so we broadened out that concept a little bit. We talked about different ways that he's already staying connected with his wife. Interestingly enough, when we went on a tour of the house, it was her wedding dress was upstairs, hung on a hanger, which you can tell just a little bit about how much they've been married for 40, 50 some years. And so I'd been in there, I don't know, 40 minutes, 45 minutes. I said, so if I go, do you think you might make those phone calls? And he said, I will make those phone calls. Mm. And it was just one of those, again, God kind of grace moments where you just know that it's time. So I bring that story up because I think there are times, again, where we just don't know. We're trying to figure out our grief. We want to get restored, but we don't even know where to start. And he lived rurally. He lived in an old farmhouse on the side of a road and had no comprehension of grief. So it gets back to this idea that we need to honor our grief. Yeah. And, interestingly enough, I remember his wife wrote a book for children, and it was signed. And as we were leaving, he brought it out and he gave it to my son. Aww. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. Get back to the car, and of course, everybody's like, where have you been? For like an hour. But we need to honor our grief. It's nice to honor it with others, but we need to honor it in ourselves.
What are ways that we can think about honoring our grief, Brian?
I think it's giving ourselves permission to have this concept that we've been kind of talking about, moving forward, staying connected. And that's a normal response to grief. Mm-hmm. I mean, we just had communion. Yeah. That's about staying connected. It's very symbolic. You look through the Old Testament, New Testament, how Old Testament different events were marked by stones and just different events that to this day are still marked. So we need to honor our grief and finding those ways that we can express it in meaningful ways. Being compassionate with ourselves.
Yeah. And I like this. the example you gave there, that idea of giving permission for those enjoyable moments. It's okay to enjoy a cupcake as a reminder, right? And
Yeah.
allowing
Yeah.
yourself those moments.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, just as a note on that, I mentioned I talked to my sister, and every year I would call her on my mom's birthday. And she would celebrate my mom's birthday by going to Tim Hortons and having a cruller donut and a hot chocolate,
Right.
because
Yeah.
that's what she always used to do with mom. So
Yeah.
that was her way of once a year being able to remember mom in a very meaningful way. And it was so great just to be able to talk about that.
Yeah.
So, but you want to have people to do that with. So we honor our grief again by what we talked about in the last session, finding people that we can open up and have a conversation with, inviting those memories,
Yeah.
whether it be a cupcake at a bakery or lighting a candle at a time of the birthday.
Yeah.
Just so many different ways we can do that.
Yeah. And I think I think oftentimes it's really scary to start that, to really, it sounded like this man that you'd spoken with, that was foreign to him, but probably a little scary too, to think about what does that feel like to let that in.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this quote that I've shared in the past by Zoe Clark Coates, who does a lot of work within infant and child and pregnancy loss. And it's a quote that says, if you give grief a seat around the table, then it's no longer the monster knocking at the door. And so a lot of times we hold it back because we go, I don't know what that's going to feel like. But actually, if we open the door and invite grief in more as seeing it as a gentle friend, which I understand can seem very odd to think of it that way, but grief is more of a bit of a friend than a monster that is just going to randomly show up and startle us, right? I think that's a helpful picture for people.
Very helpful. And it kind of goes along with this idea that we don't go through this valley alone.
Yeah.
Realizing that you're right, it can be a bit scary to talk to somebody or give yourself permission to address your grief. But that can be very difficult to do. So, yeah.
And so there's this idea of continuing bonds, which I love hearing you talk about this, Brian, because I think that this is what we're talking about here in some of these examples. And I think this is a really helpful aspect of the grief process. Can you talk a bit more about continuing bonds?
Yeah. I gave the example in the first story, or the story in the last session, about the woman who was reclaiming her father's silver.
Yeah.
That silver is going to be that connection. That's the continuing bond. The journey of going with a friend to reclaim is a connection. And I love that she took a friend to bear witness to that. That's a continuing bond. I don't know if that individual I just shared about will use a cupcake, but it's a way to stay connected. But there was a bakery that was also connected. And so I suppose if he would think a little bit more about it, there's probably other ways. He had a wedding dress, interestingly enough, that he had taken out and put on a hanger and was in one of the side rooms. And I thought, for him, that was that place he was at, trying to remember her connection, the marriage, but not knowing how to take that to the next step and honor it outside of his home. So continuing bonds give us permission to make those connections in ways that are meaningful. So there's a few things here that I'm just going to touch on in regards to continuing bonds. They're special, they can be built around special items, possessions, but they can also be about moments of going places. I mentioned my mom. When she passed away, she was a very godly mother who wanted her cremains to be at the church she attended on Vancouver Island, which has got many flowers. And she gave directions where we were to go. So I remember I was with my father and my brother and sister. We went, and it was a shovel in the ground, and we dug out the hole, and we had mom's cremains. And I remember the hole was dug, and I remember I gave the shovel to my dad, and he looked at me like a deer in the headlights. But together we gathered and we interred mom's, and then we planted 3 flowers of my mom's favorite flowers in the garden. And we marked it. And so for a couple of years after I went back, and when I was once there with my sister, we went back to the garden. And that's a continuing bond. That's a connection. And so when you think about it, even grave sites are continuing bonds. So, but we can find a way to express our grief in ways that are meaningful. They're safe. They allow us to go into that grief work side of that dual process and attend to the grief we're feeling by honoring it. And it can enhance that sense of connection. I remember that I think my dad was surprised when we went to the garden at the church and interred Mom's cremains in the ground and planted the flowers. That was a precious moment for our family.
Right. Yeah.
And so sometimes these continued bonds can happen around items. They can happen about places and events, and they have their time. It's not like I need to go back to that gravesite or to the ashes anymore. It's just, it was the right time. And for all of us, we've got a shared memory of being together as a family. And there's a bond there with that plot of land.
Yeah. And I think that's been one of the challenges with COVID is a lot of those things have been interrupted, right? A lot of those rituals or the ways that we continue those bonds, the ways that we gather together to have this shared moment that provides a little bit. Now, I'm hopeful that we're kind of getting on the other side of that, but there's a lot of grief in that, right? Missing out on those opportunities to have that closure. So you've got grief sort of layered on top of grief throughout.
Yes. Yeah. So, and you're right. It's about acknowledging, but remembering that I've always mentioned, I like these big windows in grief, that it's not like we can't do it now. I think my hope would be that there's been times in families, if there's been opportunities where there's been requests that couldn't be fulfilled, well, it may be a year, it may be 2 years, but it's not uncommon that it's like the story about the women reclaiming her father. So that was 2 years later. Yeah. That we can still go back, and it's perfectly acceptable to come up with a way to do this. And so I wanted to share yet another story today that I think kind of gets at this. And this was a story of a young man who was having a real tough go in life. Don't need to get into all the particulars. But as found out about his story, that he experienced the loss of one parent when he was very young. And it wasn't too many years after that, still when he was an infant, experienced a loss of a second parent. And so was raised by other members of the family and who did all they could, but there was still this ache, this unfinished business, and just the way they had passed. And it was time. It was time. It had been many, many years. So we talked a little bit because he had mentioned that he just can't seem to get around it. He was a musician. It really kind of gave his direction to the music that he was in, and a lot of anger, but huge expression. It was a way that he tried to work through his grief, but he said it's time to let it go. So I said, well, what would be helpful? He says, I'm not sure, but I just need to somehow let this go. So I said, is there a place that if we were to do something that we could maybe outside the city, that maybe we could do something that you could kind of just let something go? We could look for a river. Or I said, how would you like to let something go? And he said, I've always seen stories about balloon launches. He says, what about if we did some balloons? I said, okay. He came in the next session after he thought about it. He says, I really want to go forward with this. He says, I've actually written a poem. And he wrote the poem and he shared it with me, and it just brought tears to my eyes. It was so powerful. He says, I've got to let this go. This is the depth of my despair. He says, I actually took this song and I recorded it, and I've put it on a CD. And he says, I want to let it go. So I says, okay, let's meet. And he showed up whatever day we had arranged with, I think it was like 10 helium-filled balloons. And under the balloons, he had a CD that he had put a nail scratch through. He says, these are my thoughts. This is what I want to let go. I said, he says, I hope you don't mind, but I brought a friend with me. So we drove an hour outside the city to a place that was very special that he had a memory as a child. And we got out, and it was a perfect day. I mean, it was a bluebird, blue sky day. And so we did just a little prayer, nothing a lot, just being able to acknowledge that God would take this act of release and mend his heart. Just something very simple. And so we let the balloon go. And it went up. And the sun was out. And every time that CD swung in the breeze, it blinked. You ever seen a CD in the light?
Mm-hmm.
It blinked. And so it went up and up and up. And so finally we laid down on a rock. And we watched that balloon go straight up, as far as you could go without a breath of wind. And then at one point, there was one last blink, and the balloon disappeared.
Mm.
Balloons disappeared. And we all just were in this mesmerized state of wow. So we sat up, and I said, how does that feel? And he looked at me and he said, Brian, I've waited 28 years to let this go.
Mm.
Again, hugs all around, tears all around. And it just spoke to me again that this is where God is in the equation.
Yeah.
Even though he didn't carry a particularly evangelical faith, he had a strong spiritual faith. He had a strong connection with Creator God and knew that somehow this was a part of where his story needed to go. And I just love that, because this is another story of the grace of God and the nature of God in grief. And so I wanted to share that because for him, the release and the bond and the connection was built around that day. And he had done some work in writing the poem, putting it to music, and he had that connection, but he let the connection go. But at any point in time, he did have a copy of the poem, but that was his day that he could rebuild the other side of the equation. He didn't have to still live on the grief side. He was now moving on. And I saw him a number of years later, and things had really shifted around. And it was just like, wow, that's all it took. And that was God moving, because God is not impartial. God wants everybody to find that restoration. But it was built around release and finding those ways to continue the bonds with those parents in a meaningful way. Yeah. It was about balloons and songs and not the heartache. So we rewrote the narrative. I love that. God's in the business of rewriting narratives in our hearts.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So if somebody is listening to this and thinking that they want to do something like that, some sort of ritual, is there sort of like a guideline or something they can follow to create their own type of ritual?
Yeah, I think you can be as creative as you'd like. I know there's one of the funeral services in Calgary, you can plant a tree.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right. And so you get an opportunity. And I've been down to that forest of trees. And so for every family that's gathered around, and there could be a rock under the tree. But that's something that's pretty well known, is just to go. And but I think to do that, you want to know what's the purpose of doing this. And right. So I love that a lot of people have done that tree and planted one. And I think planting something, even as I did for my mom, is very meaningful. Determining what you would want to be a part. What are the items that you would like to be a part of that? Whether it's just a tree. I know if you go down there, you'll see a couple of rocks with some colors on them or some artwork. I've been out in the backcountry, and I've come to certain places where there's been something in the rock. Somebody's placed a plaque in the rock, and you can see that somebody's has gathered around, and that's where the loved one has been memorialized. So right. I'm sure there was a little gathering around that. So yeah, determining how you might want to do that. I remember years ago we were out hiking, and there's this beautiful peak that we get to, and we were up there, and I remember my youngest son saying, "This is where, if I die, I want you to spread my ashes." So having a way and knowing where you want to do that. And I think when we do it, it's at the right time again. There's no rush. But what it does is it starts to integrate who we are post-loss. It's an opportunity to catch up with ourselves. And so why are we doing this? It's time. We want the connection. We want to continue that bond. But it's also a revelation a bit to us. It's like the women on the side of the road, like the individual I talked about in the house. It was a marker along the way of getting their lives back to that place of restoration. And so
Right.
I think these are the things that are nice to have in the background when we go through the planning to be able to build a connection. And because COVID has impacted so many families in the way you had mentioned and not being able to have the gatherings, I really encourage families that if they've got the opportunity to be creative and maybe have the opportunity to do something special and put some thought into what could we do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like we mentioned last time, right? It's important for people to remember kind of like their limitations, and this takes a lot of energy and emotional energy, physical energy.
Yeah.
And so just navigating your way forward on that, being gentle
Yes.
with yourself and managing some of that energy is really important.
Yeah, it's a process over time. And I think we've covered a lot of what that dual process model and how we move from our grief and how we're constantly moving over. And I think, just be mindful that sometimes we think we're doing really well over here, and we are. I mentioned with the balloons, and I wouldn't be surprised if this individual every once in a while would slip back into old patterns and thoughts. And this is why I like when we do things. He's got something now he can rebuild his grief around as another narrative. So yeah, navigating forward is about making that choice to be able to take the grief out, to be able to walk it, to wear it, to talk it, and then put it in a place so that if we slip back, we can go, I've dealt with that. I've got a plan with that. And
Right.
we've got different narratives and different things that we can pull out. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're just on the other side of Christmas season. And certainly thinking about things like anniversaries and Christmas holidays of all sorts, birthdays, all that, that all kind of impacts the rituals and the traditions. And it can be quite difficult, but there is preparation for that we can do, right? So it doesn't have to be something we hide from, and it doesn't have to be something that hits us like a ton of bricks. Although there might be unexpected and expected feelings that come up. But do you have anything else to kind of help people navigate sort of those really big moments?
Yeah, we've just got through Christmas, and that's always something that's nice to be able to have a bit of a plan. I know I would give recommendations that if you're having a family over for the first time after a person has passed, that sometimes it's nice just to put a picture out because it takes the awkwardness out, and maybe light a candle beside the picture. And I think sometimes when people come into the house, they don't need to worry or wonder because they see a picture and a candle. Sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes it's putting something on the tree, a special decoration, or sometimes families go to services. And there's different churches that do poinsettias and different things. But it's being able to, again, having a plan beforehand. And so I guess that's why we need to talk about this, is if we let it catch us off guard and we're unprepared, we do tend to not want to go out. So putting some consideration, putting some, like putting out a picture and lighting a candle, a lot of people have not thought about that.
Yeah. They're very small, simple things to do. We're not talking about something that would require a lot of energy. But you're right, just to do that sort of takes a bit of that awkwardness away for people to go, okay, this isn't a secret. This isn't something we have to pretend didn't happen. And,
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Great idea.
So we just need to realize that, during holiday times, strong memories. I talked about my sister on my mom's birthday, going to Tim Hortons, having a hot chocolate and a cruller donut, but then she'd call me and just check in. So this is where, if we're in grief, to be able to find those people we can check in with that feels comfortable. And if we're with family members or friends, just knowing the opportunity times during these special times just to check in. It's kind of like Christmas. I know a big issue is going out in public. Well, it'd be nice to have somebody to go with. And again, having a plan that you've sought through, that you start to think of 2 weeks before even Christmas gets here, or birthdays, or anniversaries, or whatever what it is, to have a plan. Yeah. And who do you want involved? If you want anybody involved.
Yeah. No, those are really important points, Brian. So just switching gears a little bit here, when we talk about children and grief, I've had a few questions around that. I think we hear this term, kids are resilient. they'll be fine. Right.
Yeah.
And I saw something really profound the other day that it said kids, I mean, maybe in some ways kids are resilient, but it's like kids aren't resilient. They just don't always have words to express their anxieties or fears or sadness. Right. And so I think sometimes we can take the fact that kids, distract themselves or don't say much, and we say, oh, they're resilient. But for those parents that are concerned about the way their kids are grieving or want to know how to help their child through a time of grief, what do you have to say about that?
I think it's opening up the conversation if it's possible. I think children have worries, they have fears. It's something that needs to be talked about. So it's about, again, as a parent, being invested and inquiring, just trying to get a sense of where they're at and picking up on the cues if they're sad. Trying to encourage them to talk a little bit about it. I talked a little bit, I think, on one of the sessions when my son's pet died. He was 15. It was his first his loss. It was very a traumatic loss, and how Pharaoh passed. And there was 3 or 4 days went by after Pharaoh was no longer with us, and I checked in on him and said, "How you doing?" And he said, "I'm not doing very well." I said, "What's happening?" He says, "Well, Dad, I'm 15. Who wants to hear about my calf that died?" So for 3 days, he had not talked to anybody. So we talked a little bit about that. And I guess it's a grief counselor in me. So when Pharaoh, we got Pharaoh's ashes, I made sure we did that. And then I got a paw print. And there was a time when spring came that we went in the garden and we put Pharaoh's ashes in the garden. So again, my son, even though he was a teenager, we needed to find a way to talk about it in an honest way. And so, so whether they're children or whoever it is, just being able to open up the conversation in the family. And, how much can we explain? I mean, this is where concepts of heaven, afterlife come up. And it's nice to be able just to hear and just affirm that they're thinking about that. We don't have to have a theological discussion, but it is nice to just to be able to affirm and say, yes, that won't it be great to be able to see our loved ones again. Questions are important. Sometimes it's helpful for them to have choices. I like the one around Christmas, if you're doing Christmas decorations. And again, I'll just use my mom because that would be a good example of, okay, do you think Mom had a favorite decoration? Which one should we put on the tree to remember Grandma, right? Stuff like that. I know for a couple who had experienced a loss, we actually got a Christmas decoration one time just for Christmas.
Right.
And I don't know if it's still on the tree or if it had its day, but it was just an acknowledgement. And I think to encourage drawing, writing, we do it as adults, but kids, it's fun to draw, and yet they may want to draw in some sort of an expression around the loss, and you never know, might come up. But it's nice to be able to acknowledge whatever the picture is, maybe put it on the fridge. But this is for kids. They work through it. I think God is just as present in kids. But I think those questions need to be acknowledged, and just to be very gentle and just not to avoid it, but just be able to affirm.
Right. Yeah, all good tips. Thanks, Brian. Now, as we kind of close our session, our final session, there is a great resource out there that you've spoken about before, and it's mygrief.ca. Why don't you just talk a little bit about that and what kind of resource it is for people?
Yeah, so it's mygrief.ca, and it's a Canadian website. And it's got every question, video, thought that you might have about grief. And the nice thing is that you can just go on it at home on your computer. You can browse the videos. You can fill in maybe some of the things we've talked about, but you can get additional information. There are different themes. A couple of them would be things like around grieving an unexpected loss. What do we do that? What makes that differently? We talk again, it talks about understanding and moving through grief, how to manage difficult situations, how to care for yourself. And do I need more resources? And so I would encourage anybody out there that's listening to the podcast that maybe in these successions, it's rekindled a few memories in yourself. There's been a few thoughts that's moved you on to that grief side. that if you feel that, oh, maybe I should talk about this, then yeah, you can talk to somebody. If it's at our faith community, then, Christin has mentioned that you can always give her a call. And but it's nice to have some supplemental information. So I really encourage mygrief.ca. And as I think I said right at the very beginning, that, none of us have really experienced it. We don't know about it until we're in it.
Yeah.
And then we don't even know where the resources are. So mygrief.ca is a huge resource. Really encourage you to not only use it, but if you've got a family member or a friend that has experienced a loss, give them run off a little card or text them and say, here's some really good resources for you. So we should give that a go.
I think that's really important what you're saying, Brian. A lot of times we look for resources while we're in the thick of things, right? And that can be more difficult. So it's our hope with these podcasts and also resources like mygrief.ca that would help people just have a little bit kind of there for you either now or for when that time comes. I think we all will face grief in our life. So it's good to have those resources available.
Yeah, and even as we've talked, maybe there's been some that have thought about some of those memories I talked about, trauma and grief, that can be totally overwhelming. And, we're not really good about addressing that, but there may have been something that kind of resonated. And I really encourage you, if, you kind of thought, there are some good counselors out there. It's a faith-based perspective. There's some good faith-based counselors, whatever orientation, whatever background. Sometimes it's nice to have somebody that understands the culture of diversity, different orientations, just to be able to reach out for some help.
Yeah.
Because it can sit there like that young man, 28 years to whether it was time for that drawer to be opened. And sometimes that drawer can be a lot longer than 28 years. And then I say there's something radically wrong here. I don't want to say, oh, you need to look at that. But I think that there's just something saying, maybe I should just look at that one last time.
Yeah.
But do it with a professional, somebody who can understand the nature of trauma. And I just really encourage that. But again, first and foremost, that we are in relationship with a wonder-working, powerful God that is mighty, everlasting, and it has peace connected. And so God is there in all of this. And I think what drew me into working in grief, it started way back when I was working in a hospital, as I started to notice that God is involved in people's lives, no matter what background. And I remember there was this light went on and said, well, Brian, if you want to see God move, go to where God is moving. And I found that was a revelation for me, and why it kind of opened the doors to move into chaplaincy and grief support. And I would encourage everybody who may be listening that if you want to see God move, get connected with people, because there's where you see the grace. And for Westside, it's about the surprising grace of that we honor. And in grief, as we've talked, there is that surprising grace. So for many of you who have maybe not been involved because you didn't have a context or any kind of models, that didn't understand the nature of your own grief or the importance of coming alongside and falling in behind, I really encourage you to take that step, because I think this is where we see God move as a community, is when we get involved in people's lives, but in a way that's got some organization. And hopefully these 6 sessions have given a little bit of a framework, a little bit of a context for not only to help you, those of you who are grieving, but for those of you who want to come alongside. It gives you some models, it gives you some understanding, and hopefully it just gives you the encouragement that we don't walk alone. The Holy Spirit is a part of this process, and I love that as part of our faith.
Thank you, Brian. I think that everything you said there is just so important, and I will echo all of that and say that please reach out if you need some resources. We do have people that we refer, wonderful mental health practitioners that we can help refer you to, and part of the Westside community or not part of the Westside community as of yet, but you've been following along, we're happy to be journeying with you, and we're happy to be in dialogue with you. So please feel free to reach out at WKC, care@wkc.org. Sorry. Anyways, Brian, thank you so much. for these last 6 sessions. It's been a privilege to sit in them with you and to hear all your wisdom and compassion, and just we're really grateful for you. So thank
you. I'm grateful for you to keeping me on track. Thank you. We'll do it again sometime.
We will, hopefully in person soon.
Wouldn't that be great?
That'd be great. Okay, well, take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Blessings.
Blessings.